and welcome to the Windows in Time, History of Bear Creek from Salmon Stream to Open Sewer and back again. Windows in Time programs are presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. By the way, I'm Carrie Tanhill, I'm the Adult Services Librarian. So just a few upcoming programs. SOHS is having a wreath making event. That is on, let's see here. It is on Saturday. I don't know if it's Saturday. It's November 28th from 11 to 3. It does cost. Alice, can you fill me in on how much the cost is for the wreath making event?
Yes, if you're a member of SOHS, you can buy the wreath making kit for $10. If you're not, it's $15. And you could just buy the kit and take it home, or you can make the kit at the farm and we'll have people there who can help. We do follow COVID safe rules in wearing a mask and maintaining a distance, and all tables and equipment will be sanitized between groups using them. But it's great fun to have your own homemade Christmas wreath, and all the parts of it are from natural ingredients, mostly from the farm, so from Hanley Farm. So Hanley Farm, Saturday, November 28th, 11 to 3.
Cool. Thanks, Alice. And then Jackson County Library Services will be having a program this Saturday. If you're interested in growing a pollinator garden, we're having a program this Saturday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. And you can register for that at our website, jcls.org. And also for our Windows in Time next month, Larry Mullally is going to be telling us stories about the Chinese workers who helped bring the railroads to Southern Oregon between in the 1880s. So if you haven't registered for that, please go to jcls.org. So we're about to get started with our program. Many thanks to Jeff for joining us today. Just to keep in mind, the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I will give it over to Jeff, who's also a historian and lecturer, and show us about his presentation today.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm also an archaeologist, by the way, and that's going to come into play towards the end of this presentation. So I just wanted to get that out there. Okie doke. So people in Bear Creek. This is a short history. I decided not to give that big, long-winded subtitle that was in the newspaper, but that subtitle from clean stream to dirty stream to somewhat clean stream again is basically the storyline here. Bear Creek's been carving its valley between the Cascade Range on one side and the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains on the other side for about 30 million years. But I hope to give a much shorter history of Bear Creek today and what it has experienced over just the past 200 years or so. So this red circle, Central Point, Medford, the Bear Creek Valley, the entire Bear Creek Valley is now home to getting up towards 200,000 people, which just amazes me. I've lived in the valley since 1969. It's just flabbergasting to compared to what it was like when I was here back in the late 60s. So look at this very dense settlement and all the people right close to Bear Creek. But few of us give the creek a second thought, probably, even though we probably pass or even cross it daily. And perhaps some of us are only reminded of its existence by some local businesses that we go to or drive past. So Bear Creek's length is approximately 30 miles to its confluence with the Rogue River up here. Now, where does it begin? Officially, that 30 miles of Bear Creek itself begins where Immigrant Creek and Neo Creek join, very close to the Ashland Airport. So above that, it's still part of the Bear Creek Valley, of course, but the official Bear Creek starts there. The valley itself is about 100 square miles, whereas the total watershed, which we're looking at here, is about 400 square miles. And the creek has over 80 tributaries within that watershed. You can see a lot of them here coming down off the Cascades, the foothills of the Cascade Range over here, and coming down out of the Klamath Siskiyous to the west, southwest over here. And those tributaries, of course, bring the water down from the mountain snows. So the upper Bear Creek Valley, this is looking south from the Cascade side, from the foothills of the Cascades, the Cascade Range, the volcanic Cascades. And we're looking south to southwest or so. And we're seeing, of course, the freeways just out of sight here. You would see it if this was a little more clear, going right up the slope of Ogden Hill right here, Siskiyou Summit right here, Pilot Rock, Klamath Siskiyous, of course, over here, and Mount Shasta off in the distance. And then another shot of the upper Bear Creek Valley, and this is looking eastward across the upper valley from Ashland, from a hill up in the top of the northwest side of Ashland. So you're looking from the foothills of the Siskiyou Mountains across the valley to the Cascade Range. And because these mountains face to the southwest, which is the hottest, driest aspect towards the sun that you can be on, they tend to be much more open, a lot less in the way of forest cover, because it's more droughty, dry up there, and hotter. Hottest time of the day when you're facing to the southwest. And let's see, okay, so the lower Bear Creek Valley, where the densest human population is located in the widest part of the valley around Medford. And then, of course, further downstream to the north, Bear Creek joins the Rogue River directly across from Lower Table Rock. So until well into the 20th century, Bear Creek was notorious among local people for its major floods that were always creating new channels. And I will be mentioning flooding a little bit later again. But back in the day, naturally, Bear Creek was not constrained as it is today by development and by channelization, by barriers. When the whites first began settling the Bear Creek Valley, one former main channel was well to the east of the present creek bed, where East Main Street in Medford first begins to rise up into those gently rolling hills of East Medford. And there was another channel that went right through the middle of today's Hawthorne Park. So you can tell, things have moved around a little bit. and that's not in a great amount of time that this has happened. Okay, but 200 years ago, before the arrival of people like us, only a very few thousand people lived in the Bear Creek Valley. The indigenous people, the native people, hunting and gathering as these women in their traditional skull caps, woven basketry skull caps are doing. The populations were relatively small in the Bear Creek Valley. This is a woman known to the whites as Frances Johnson. She was a Takelma, one of the last Takelma speakers, who was interviewed by several anthropologists in the early 20th century. Her Takelma name was Wishguashan. Alas, we do not know what that means. At least I don't. Maybe recorded somewhere and I've just neglected to pick it up. So she was one of the last speakers of her language, and she provided much of the information we now have on the Takelma's way of life to those early day anthropologists. So how did her people live? And by the way, notice what the whites called the 111 tattoo, which women almost always tattooed their chins. They'd be tattooed in various patterns, but this was the most common. These 3 stripes. So here is Bear Creek. Here is the Rogue River. There's Crater Lake. So it's coming up from north of Crater Lake, the Rogue River coming down, Little Butte Creek and some of the other tributaries, and meets Bear Creek here in the Bear Creek Valley and continues the Rogue on its way to the ocean of Gold Beach. But focusing on Bear Creek Valley, you can see that within the valley, there are 2 different indigenous groups, the Upland Takelma and the Shasta. They had very similar ways of life, but extremely different languages, as different perhaps as Mandarin Chinese is from Hindi or Urdu, very divergent languages dating from thousands of years ago. So the Shasta in the Bear Creek Valley, the main Shasta lived over the hill, over the Siskiyou Summit in the Klamath River Canyon and the Shasta Valley. Here's the Shasta River, Klamath River Canyon, the Middle Klamath. That's where most of them live. But the band that lived on our side of the Siskiyou Crest in Bear Creek, they were known as the Ikiriakutsu. And later they just simply became known as the Bear Creek Band. And they called Bear Creek Usaho. And we do not know what that means, unfortunately, at least I don't. But the Takelma, including the Upland Takelma who lived in this area, including the Bear Creek Valley, they called Bear Creek Sikutat, which means the anthropologist's translation was simply dirty water. Well, that's not because it was so filled with sewage or anything like that. It's simply, as a newspaper article yesterday pointed out, I think it did, it's because of all the turbidity from the streams coming down out of the Cascades with all those volcanic clays that really cloud the water of those tributaries and then cloud the water of Bear Creek after storms. And even for much of the year, it is like that. So Bear Creek was never really known, excuse me, here we are. Bear Creek was never really known for crystal clear water before the whites showed up. So how did the people live? Not by farming, no farming, and there are no crops grown except for tobacco, but they did manage their landscape, as most of us know quite well now, in various ways, but most especially with repeated fire for various purposes in various places, including the lowlands of the Bear Creek Valley. And they used fire as well during hunting, deer hunting drives. They used fire to create and maintain good gathering areas, whether it be California black oak, acorn groves, and so forth. And down the river at the mouth of the Rogue River, the native people, the Tututni there, would even set off fires at the mouth of the river to signal to the Klamath that it's time to come up the Rogue River and swim upstream that the people will welcome them and treat them with respect. The staple gathering edible plants were the acorns, of course, from the oaks, and blue camas. Many, many others as well, but these were the two staples. Now, the California black oak was the favorite acorn tree. Tasted better, was considered far more desirable than the Oregon white oak, which is the most plentiful oak down in the Bear Creek Valley itself. Whereas the California black oak, which needs a little more moisture, tended to be at higher elevations, but also because of available moisture down along Bear Creek itself. There were Quercus kilogii, or California black oak. And of course, Bear Creek provided anadromous fish, spawning runs of Chinook and coho salmon, steelhead trout. On the river, the Rogue River, that is probably where most of the main fisheries were located in our area, with some of the rapids and rocks and riffles on the downstream from Bear Creek, just a little ways towards Gold Hill, major fishery spot there. They also took other species, the lamprey eel, very important species for eating. But on Bear Creek itself, they may have used woven brush weirs as fish traps on Bear Creek. And in 1827, the Hudson's Bay Company fur trader Peter Ogden, who was the first white in the Bear Creek Valley, he wrote in his journal in February of 1827 with disgust that he'd just been watching hungry Takelma taking the dead, rotting salmon out of lower Bear Creek to eat. So they weren't averse to taking beat up salmon as well. And that really wasn't all that uncommon. And the grizzly bears that were quite plentiful in Jackson County and elsewhere in that day, they would hang out along Bear Creek and grab salmon as well. And drying of salmon would often provide a good surplus for the winter food supply. Could be stored away in underground storage places where the dogs and other critters couldn't get to it. Okay, so Peter Skeen Ogden, Hudson's Bay Company, British company, and his mostly French Canadian as well as Iroquois fur trappers were the first non-native people in the Bear Creek Valley. And they came northward into the valley from the Klamath River via Siskiyou Pass, bringing their steel leg-hold traps and setting these traps in the streams in Bear Creek and in its tributaries for several days as they made their way steadily down the stream towards the Rogue, and then eventually on to other places. Their path, the trappers' path through the Bear Creek Valley, was followed during the 1830s by more trappers, and then in the 1840s by American explorers, and then wagon trains of American immigrants coming west over the Applegate Trail, coming over from the Klamath Basin that way. And then here in the Bear Creek Valley, turning north and heading to the Willamette Valley, which was at that time the promised land of the Oregon country before people had begun to settle down here. And then, yes, in the early 1850s came a flood of gold miners and scores of farmers who came to stay in the Bear Creek Valley, which resulted in the usual story: ethnic cleansing through ongoing violence and forced removal of the indigenous people. And it was during these troubled times of the early 1850s that Bear Creek got two different names for whites. In 1851, it was dubbed Stewart River or Stewart's River for the officer, the cavalry officer who was, and his name was James Stewart, like Jimmy Stewart, the actor, who was died of his wounds after a battle with Native people on up the Rogue River a ways from Bear Creek. He was, his body was then brought to where they camped close to the present day Phoenix. And the major in charge at the time named it Stewart's River. But then it became Bear Creek, which it stayed. And that name came about because local settlers in 1853, I believe it was, encountered 3 grizzly bears along the creek, and they weren't feasting on salmon, but on a dead ox. And one of the bears attacked the men and their dogs, and they barely escaped with their lives. And so Bear Creek got its lasting name. And with that, in the 1850s, with the permanent settlement by whites in the Bear Creek Valley, this begins a period of stress on Bear Creek's previous natural conditions, starting relatively slowly and gently at first, but eventually becoming quite significant. One of the early impacts was hydraulic mining. You see that these giants or monitors with the powerful jet, the spray of water coming out, washing away the hillsides of old ancient river gravels and then putting them through sluice boxes down below. And this is called the head wall. This is where they're going to be mining this away. See all the cobbles, the old river deposits here, but this is as far as they got at this point in their mining. So that's called a head wall. It's over here as well. Now, this is not the place I'm going to be telling you about, but hydraulic mining, gold mining, essentially all kinds of gold mining occurred in our vicinity, mainly in the Applegate Valley, well within the Siskiyous or near Gold Hill. But there was some large scale hydraulic mining like this for gold, as shown here, at a place called Rockfellow Diggings. And this was located south of Talent. If you can picture where South Talent Avenue comes into Highway 99, it comes back down into Highway 99, south of Creel and south of Talent, and then head north from where that junction is, north kind of along the creek, and you're looking to the west. You're looking, as you're heading towards Talent and Medford, you're looking to the left as you're driving up 99, right where New Sammy's restaurant used to be until the fire, and where Roadside Relics and later became the Gem Store were located before the fire. That particular area, you will see behind those where the structures were, and there's still some houses and stuff there, you will see the head wall of Rockfellow Diggings, where this very big, fairly long-lasting hydraulic gold mine was occurring. And it was occurring with Chinese miners doing a lot of the labor. And at the very same time, meaning I think it was 1884 or so, that Chinese railroad workers were building the railroad south from Medford to reach Ashland. So that kind of sets things up for Larry next month, Larry Mullaley's talk. So we talked about the miners, how about the farmers? This is an 1880s lithograph of the farm of Mr. C.T. Payne that was right across the creek from present-day Phoenix. And right here, we can still see in this lithograph the familiar face of Payne Cliffs off in the distance in the foothills of the Cascade Range. So Bear Creek would be behind this viewpoint of this farm here in back of you. Jacksonville. This is a lithograph that almost certainly used some sort of photography. I don't know if they used some sort of oblique way of changing perspective, but it is quite accurate in general sense of Jacksonville. The layout, here's Hanley Hill out here, and way out here you see Griffin Creek. And what do you see along Griffin Creek? Well, almost certainly those are ponderosa pines lining the creek, which you don't really find many of anymore. They were logged and other things happened to them as well. And the old lithographs and photographs do show that the major creeks in Bear Creek Valley, both Bear Creek and others like Lower Jackson Creek, Griffin Creek, and others, had these pine and oak galleries as part of the riparian vegetation along either side of the creek. Something that's basically been gone for many, many years now. And as in this 1860s photograph from Jacksonville, there's the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church. These are the Chinese quarters here up on what's still called Main Street. Here's Griffin Creek again. Oh, sure like ponderosa pines to me, but way out here, way out in the distance beyond Griffin Creek is what I believe to be Bear Creek. And it shows the same kind of pine vegetation, that pine gallery along Bear Creek that are mostly gone now. And today, along Bear Creek, it's mainly cottonwood, alder, and maple. Whereas originally, and there's still some remnants of this community to be found in a few places, such as near Ashland along the Bear Creek Greenway, is ponderosa pine and California black oak. So in the 1880s comes the railroad, and this perspective taken from up on the hill northwest of Ashland, looking towards the plaza here, and here's the old flouring mill, and this is what's now Lithia Park. Here's the plaza back in the day. The railroad has not arrived yet, but it would be coming right along through here. But look at the creeks, including Bear Creek. Look at those pine trees. So that is a vegetation type that's been absent for many years. And as a result of the railroad founded and platted the little town of Medford that soon grew into Southern Oregon's metropolis. This is way back in the late 1880s when it was still all wooden structures, false fronted storefronts on Main Street in Medford. So where'd these people get their drinking water? Well, they took it right out of Bear Creek. That was the domestic supply for Medford as it grew. And it stayed that way for a number of years, actually. While Bear Creek itself, during these years, it played a kind of a bucolic part in rural life, in small town life in Jackson County. You can just kind of see, the barefoot boy with cheeks of tan with his cane pole out there, his overalls rolled up, and he's out there fishing for something. He's got a little jar of worms with him. Or you can see the skinny dipping. That was very common. This is actually at Jackson Hot Springs, but the Bear Creek flowed right next to this hot springs at that time. So it actually was a pretty warm place. There, at that location in the 1930s and 40s, Bear Creek was channelized and given an entirely new channel to go through when they built the Pacific Highway, the new Pacific Highway. So Bear Creek, aside from skinny dipping and fishing with a pole, folks will go out and snag salmon. Just you know, they're up there trying to spawn, and you just go grab them right in the shallows. Some people even use sticks of dynamite to stun the trout in Bear Creek. There was shooting ducks from the side of the creek in the side sloughs right in Medford back in the day. And people went down to the creek and captured hundreds of pond turtles, the now getting fairly rare Western pond turtle, to sell to San Francisco restaurants for their very expensive terrapin soup. And of course, there was undoubtedly mass full immersion baptisms by local Protestant ministers. But floods have been part of Bear Creek's written history since 1853, when young Wellborn Beeson talked about how near the Talent area, it was virtually a lake, all in all the lowlands of the Bear Creek Valley there. It was just huge, wide area of water. And subsequent big flood in 1860, 1890, huge flood that swept away virtually all of the bridges along Bear Creek and the Rogue River in Jackson County. And in the 20th century, big floods in 1927, 1948, 1955, 1964, the big one, 1974, I was here for that one, in 1997, the New Year's flood in 1997. So flooding, a big part of the history. This is in 1940 here, somewhere in the vicinity of Medford. So span this flood-prone stream, people did, and spanned it more permanently than the original log structures, log stringer bridges with metal truss, through truss bridge like here in Medford. And you can tell where this is. There's Main Street looking out down towards the courthouse. So by 1900, Medford's newspaper was condemning the city's drinking water, which still came from Bear Creek, as liquid soil, meaning basically mud. It's very, very muddy water. And a desperate search was launched for a good source. Initially, they found a source that turned out to be not so great after all, up at Fish Lake. Quite expensive to do, but they got it there. And later, much later, came the present major source of underground mountain spring water from Big Butte Springs up near the little town of Butte Falls. But at this point, just think of these folks still getting their drinking water out of Bear Creek, which by this time was quite full of raw sewage. Wagon loads of garbage were dumped into it at night by Medford and other town residents. They weren't supposed to, but they did it. Dead dogs and dead cats, dead cows would be seen floating down the creek. There were several slaughterhouses along the creek that poured their offal, OFFAL, directly into the creek, their waste directly into the stream. This is the history of stress and abuse at Bear Creek. And then to add insult to injury, came after 1905 or so, Medford becomes a hub of the Bear Creek Valley's pear orchard boom. This photo is looking towards Bear Creek, back east down Main Street, and Roxytown is barely visible there, but all these young fruit trees, mostly pears, which this picture had serious implications for Bear Creek. The old wheat farms of the early day farmers, the settlers in the Bear Creek Valley, and the livestock ranchers from 50 years before or so, they're now becoming replaced by very high density agricultural acreage, which meant, of course, more water. Much more water is needed for those thirsty young fruit trees, which meant huge diversions of water from Bear Creek's major high elevation tributaries. Not so much from Bear Creek itself, but it doesn't really make that much difference when you're taking water out of its upper large tributaries, diverting it into canals and delivering it to go to orchards and alfalfa pastures and so forth. And not many of it makes it actually back down to the creek. So now Bear Creek now begins a serious decline, both in its water quantity and in its water quality. And even before this, Bear Creek's naturally low late summertime flows, just part of the regular natural way of things with our typical summer drought in our Mediterranean, so-called Mediterranean type climate here. Bear Creek itself had already been over-allocated, its water over-allocated by means of water withdrawals to farmers, ranchers, and others. Mills, flouring mills, so on. So this is the then new East Main Street Bridge, which is still there, built with New Deal dollars. It actually, New Deal dollars helped to widen the original bridge substantially, as Medford was really, really growing by that time. There's Bear Creek down there. And also during the New Deal, Works Progress Administration and Civil Works Administration dollars were spent on flood control and channelization of various places of Bear Creek to keep it in its place, people thought, you know, keep it from jumping its channel and doing this and that the way it always used to do. We don't want it messing us up. We want to kind of keep it trapped in a narrower channel. So that was going on. And as I said before, just north of Ashland, Uncle Sam's generosity also resulted during the New Deal in channelization of a section of Bear Creek right through what had been solid rock. And you can still see it when you're driving down Highway 99. If you look towards the creek and you see on the far side of the creek, this, you know, rocky bank, that used to be a solid slope that went all the way over to the other side of Highway 99. That's from when Bear Creek used to meander around next to Jackson Hot Springs. But it was a huge expenditure of federal and state dollars in the early 1960s that really affected Bear Creek in a substantial way. in part because it just enabled the fantastic population growth of the Bear Creek Valley. The original plans for what became Interstate 5 was to divert it at Eugene over the Cascades and down through the Klamath Basin, just as the original plans for the railroad had done that. But there's too many people over here. Politics won the day, and so I-5 came through this very, very expensive southwestern part of Oregon and up over the very expensive to cross Siskiyou Crest. But looking here, all this stuff here, looking from the top of Lower Table Rock into basically the lowest part of the Bear Creek Valley, right along the Rogue River here, you can see the ponds that resulted from the huge sand and gravel operations, where all those alluvial deposits, the gravel was put through huge rock crushers working 24/7 that was used for making the concrete that was I-5's initial pavement surface. So a lot of the old Rogue River and Bear Creek's ancient Ice Age era alluvial deposits, you know, stream deposits from long ago were quarried and turned into pavement. And then there's the story of this thing, the viaduct. What in the heck was that all about? Well, they'd already decided by then that the freeway was going to come through the Bear Creek Valley, not through the upper Klamath Basin, and then go the back way down into Weed, California that way, the way Highway 97 does today. No, it was going to come right through the Bear Creek Valley. But the state, and some of you have probably familiar with the story that I heard when I moved here, that this thing was all due to the Rogue Valley's great post-World War II mover and shaker, Glenn Jackson, who became head of the Oregon Highway Commission. And in fact, the newer bridge over the Columbia River at Portland is called the Glenn Jackson Bridge, the interstate bridge over to Washington. He was a big time guy, a real political powerhouse, extremely influential. But that's not really true, that it was his decision. He wasn't the head of the Highway Commission quite yet. Originally, the ODOT engineers wanted to build I-5 back on the west side of Medford, kind of out towards Hanley Road and out in that area. And that would have taken out the most productive pear growing land in the valley out there at the time. So outfits like Bear Creek Orchards, Harry and David, and other movers and shakers said, no, we don't want it there. So then they decided, well, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. Well, then came the plan to put it on over in East Medford, kind of along Foothill Road. And that's where the wealthier people, East Medford, lived, including Glenn Jackson. And that did not go over so well. And so it was decided to kind of split the difference and build this somewhat of a monstrosity right through the middle of Medford, which changed things that, we would have an entirely different commercial and residential landscape today if it wasn't for this. I think it was, in the end, it was kind of a godsend that they did this compared to what it would have been like if they hadn't straddled or hugged the banks of Bear Creek. Okay, so we're getting closer to the present day. In recent decades, local residents, more and more of us, have started to rediscover Bear Creek. You got a Bear Creek Park down in Medford. And thanks to farsighted people back in the 1970s, we've got a Bear Creek Greenway. Which is almost 20 miles long from Ashland to Central Point, and one hopes beyond, eventually tying into perhaps a trail system along the road, part of which is already there on the upper road and lower road. And also with this discovery has come a focus on water quality, trying to restore water quality in various ways, from removing some of the old diversions and barriers along Bear Creek to fish migration upstream. And there are a number of them. Most are gone now. This is sampling of water from Bear Creek, trying to eliminate the invasive non-native plants like the Himalayan blackberry. Good luck. So water quality has become an issue and is taking a lot of energy, dollars, and attention. It's a good thing. There's various plantings going on along the creek. Pines and other, or closer, maybe willows and other riparian vegetation, but ponderosa pines are being replanted, bringing them back. There's some near Ashland. This is called large woody debris, or LWD, which is purposely placed in or adjacent to the creek to provide cover for anadromous fish and places for spawning beds. So things are looking good, and the salmon are coming back. And yes, floods are still a factor in Bear Creek. But what I want to end with here is a story we're all extremely familiar with, is the recent fire. Just days or a week or two after the Alameda fire, being an archaeologist and seeing what I could see from Highway 99 and so forth, it was like, wow, you can see everything. There's no more blackberries, no more underbrush. You can see everything. And I wanted to take a look and cover a lot of the ground within the burned portion of the Greenway, the part that was burned by the Alameda fire. Of course, that's not the entire Greenway. It burned from the northern end of Ashland to just about the southern end of Medford. But it burned pretty hot. But as you can see here, you can see good long distances. The blackberries that were once, head high in hedges and made the ground surface completely invisible are gone, as a lot of the other underbrush and understory vegetation. So I began walking the area, seeing what I could see, and I was interested. It quickly became apparent to me that the entire Greenway, the portion that I walked, was all relatively recent floodplain. There's older channels, yes, but these would have dated, from floods within, the past 100 years or less, and old side channels that still had water in them, even from high water a winter or two ago. The whole Greenway, just active floodplain. So in my opinion, it's highly, highly unlikely that A, Indigenous people would have camped in the floodplain. They're smarter than that. And B, camped in terms of a winter village. I'm sure they went down there, get salmon and so forth, but did not reside down there. And so the possibility of archaeological sites, archaeological evidence from the Takelma and Shasta people, extremely, extremely sparse, and whatever I might find down there was probably transported there by relatively recent floods and is hence lying on the surface. Very, very active. There's levees, natural levees and channels, and ridges, and so forth, that whole area. And the same would be the case for early historic period, early white settlement. So I figured, basically what I'm liable to find because of this character of recent floodplain are things that are generally pretty recent, might have been built in the higher, more flood-free portions on the margins of the floodplain, and are not that old. And that's pretty much what I did find. There is, limited property damage from the fire. This was a bench, but mainly the damage was to vegetation. And you can say soil. There's a poignancy with the lost pets from the fire, food still left out within the burn. It was just about berry harvest time on those blackberry hedges, and so the fire enjoyed a meal of blackberries. But as you can see here and here, those blackberry vines are springing right back up within just days after the fire. This would have been just, head high with berries. There's a side channel with slack water, stagnant water still in it there. And other things are springing up right after the fire. Homeless camps are right back along the creek. What I did find in certain areas away from the most, let's call it swiftest, strongest current portions of the floodplain were some probably 1930s, 40s, even 50s poured concrete foundations within the greenway. And they probably built some sort of shed or storage structure of some sort. And figured it was going to be okay for some decades until maybe the next big high water came, and maybe even then the water would be up the much higher floodplain terrace, not strong enough to sweep the structure entirely away. So I found various foundations and a lot of broken up concrete. I'm sure any of these structures that were still up when the greenway was developed were removed. The foundations remain. Near Ashland, here's the greenway right up here. And what you're seeing up here is a Talon irrigation ditch concrete flume, a canal or ditch, if you will, that's above Eagle Mill Road, right up here. And what this and the other big old poured concrete pylons are, and this one is, I'm not that tall, but my head probably comes up to about here. It's got some height on it. This is a pylon that was the highest of a series of them that originally an outlet from the original probably wooden flume before it became poured concrete up here, maybe in the 20s or so forth, came out in pipe and then hit a concrete stand up slope here. And then in that pipe that came over across the top, you can see the strap that held that pipe in place. The pipe's now gone. It went on across the creek towards, Highway 99 and so forth. What's called Geppetto's Farm and all that on that side of Bear Creek. And you could see more of the pylons that carried it all the way over. And so that's all been gone for a while. But that was kind of interesting to me, and I had never noticed it before. Near a orchard in Phoenix, orchardists decided to get rid of some old smudge pots and just took them and probably threw them in the brush. Maybe the blackberries here, where they still remain. And melted from radiant heat aluminum cans from the fire at homeless camps, tent poles, a cot. I found older dump scatters, probably dating from the earliest near the edge of the floodplain from the 1940s and 50s. Dump scatters where a local resident would just drive on a back road with a garbage can full of their debris, not wanting to take it to the town dump, and just heaved it over the side down into the brush and berries. And this is an older beer can, all tinned sheet metal with the old church key opening. So that's probably at least mid-60s and older, that dump. And then this dump that's got a pull tab with an aluminum top and the rest is tin steel. Those pull tabs went away in 1972, so that's helped me date this dump. Here's a dump with a 1947 license plate. Pacific Wonderland. It's an old, was it time?
Yeah, it's really close to 1 o'clock and we just
Okay,
have
I'm
a few
almost done.
questions.
Almost done. Here we go. A Chrysler, a Ford, a very dateable artifact, a face mask from 2020. And the trees, most of them, the cottonwoods are dead. And it's unknown to me whether the formerly surviving ponderosa pines and California black oak will come back. Thank you.